Turn the lights back on. Wow. Retro electro tech. When real audio ruled the world.
Greetings once again, ladies and gents. This is Retro Ernest of Retro Electro Tech, back with the Siel Cruise synthesizer. And the board you saw me touching up solder joints on a moment ago, and there were a lot of them that had to be touched up, they were pretty rough, was this board here. And as you can see, all of the boards are reinstalled, as well as all their cables and connectors, and I went through and cleaned all the sockets and pins, all the connectors. They've been cleaned, and as I mentioned a moment ago, and let me go ahead and zoom in, and hopefully you can see some detail. The good majority of these solder joints I touched up, reflowed, and the other side as well, because there were all these socket pins, and many of them were in really rough shape. And I demonstrated in the previous video that there was a connection issue. As a matter of fact, when I wedged the pointer between the connectors and kind of pried up on things very lightly, I was re-establishing the signal involving the mono operation, which was not working properly. And again, I initially thought it might be the VR, but it wasn't, and it appeared to again involve these connectors here. So we'll see. I don't know for sure yet, because I haven't powered this thing up and tested it, because I have to recap the power supply board still. I'm going to do that next after I point out a few things. But I'm pretty sure what I did will resolve the problem, because I touched up a lot of really suspect solder joints, especially on the other side of the board. They were pretty shabby. So I could see why there was probably that connection issue. And like I said, well, not probably, there certainly was, because again, when I was manipulating the connectors and kind of probing around with the pointer, that was definitely influencing the signal, cutting in and out. So there was something going on for sure. So I'm pretty sure that I will have that that mono button working again, and the mono aspect of the synth functioning again. So let me go ahead and back out again, because I'm going to point out something else here. Okay, and here we are. You recall in another video I pointed out that one of these key guides, this one here obviously, the plastic protrusion here that you see that holds the key bushing in place, and obviously acts as a key guide slash stop, and limits the range of travel of the key, which is why this key here was out of alignment and was lifting too high. And I pointed that out as to why that was, but the plastic was busted, and I fabricated this this guide in its place out of, I believe it was 16 gauge steel, and the other individual used something, it was almost like really just aluminum or something. It was very flimsy, and that's why it had failed. The idea was okay, but the actual fabrication of the part was poorly executed. So anyways, I fabricated this. It's solid as a rock, And not only was I able to secure it properly to the key bed on the underside, of course, and as you can see, also on the plastic here underneath this part, I used a very strong 2-part epoxy before I laid this down on what was left of the plastic here, okay, because it was broken off more at the end, and there still remained this section of plastic right here, you know, all this section here, so I was able to lay this down on top of it. And again, I used a 2-part epoxy before I even bolted it to the underside, so this thing is solid as a rock. It's not going anywhere. So so I got that all squared away, and I'm going to get the keys back in place, and then let me just pan up real quick. And again, as you can see here, I'm going to get this recapping underway. So once I come back, I will have it recapped. The keys will be back on the keyboard here, on the key bed, and then I will fire it up and test it out. Okay, so I'll be back in just a moment. And here we are at the power supply board, and I'm getting ready to install these main filter caps or reservoir caps. And the purpose of these main filter caps is, as they maintain their charge, is to hold up the power supply, for lack of a better term, and of course filter and smooth the ripple of our rectified DC voltage. And that's the simple explanation. Like all things, there's more details that we can dive into, but I'm not going to do that here. This is the age of the internet, as I often say, so you can let your fingertips do the walking and you know, gather up all the research that you want to gather up on the topic. But that's the gist of it once again. And the one thing I do want to mention is that in preparation for, you know, mounting these main filter caps, there are obvious first steps. Now, this isn't going to be a video where I go into a lot of detail on that, but like all of my videos, or a good percentage of them, I like to throw in a few pointers or tech tips, whatever you want to consider them. And sometimes I don't want to do that. I just want to showcase a piece of equipment, maybe show a little before and after, and just vibe into the piece of equipment. So it's not always going to be about tips and education because of, you know, time constraints and so forth. But I will try to throw that in the different videos I do, so that everybody could get a little something out of it, perhaps. That's the objective anyways. So the first steps are the obvious things, like for example, the main filters here, they're axial caps, okay? Just think of like the axle of a car, and you know, the way the leads are configured, as opposed to radial and all that stuff, and you can look up that information as well. But because the way these caps lay on the board, you know, you have to give consideration obviously as to, you know, where you're going to bend the leads so that they fall into the through holes on the board. And so no rocket science there. You don't have to sit there with a ruler and get everything absolutely precise. Not a big deal, but you know, at the very least, you know, you just want to lay your cap in place, and of course, you know, just kind of estimate where you're going to, you know, make the bend, and then you can get your pliers in there. I use needle nose pliers or whatever, and then just, you know, give it a nice clean bend, careful bend. And I already have these this cap here bent to drop into this position, as you can see, and you know, it does just that. Just, you know, falls right in nice and neat. There's a nice you know, 90-degree bend to the lead, so it looks nice and neat. And you'll also notice too that the information is facing upward, the capacitor's value, the information there. so the next guy can see what's on board, and that's always a nice courtesy. Plus it's a positive reflection on your work, and it shows that you're neat, that you're professional, that you know what's going on, and that's always a good thing. And also too, you don't have to do it, but I am going to use some of this spaghetti tubing because there is a good amount of lead exposed, and even though it's not necessary, I like to dress up the lead a little bit, make it look a bit nicer, and it's kind of a safety thing too. If somebody was probing around in there and they kind of slipped and they unintentionally made contact with the cap, the lead or something, well, it's got some tubing on it. Again, that's not why I do it in this case, but it just kind of dresses it up a little bit, but I suppose it serves twofold if you want to look at it that way. But it's just a good, neat way to work, and it's the way I like to work. Additionally, and the most important of all, is giving consideration to the polarity of the cap. In this case, electrolytic capacitors are polarized, and you have to pay attention to the negative side and the positive side. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but that's fairly straightforward on capacitors, as far as like this cap shows arrows pointing toward the positive side. And also the positive side of caps typically, not in all cases, have this groove or indentation around the upper rim here of the cap, okay, denoting the positive side. So, but that's not always the case though. So anyways, things like that. So just pay attention. And you'll notice on this board here, there's screen printing or just printing on the board indicating the positive side and obviously the negative side. But also keep in mind too, very important, that doesn't mean that the printing was laid down on the board correctly. I've seen cases, especially with receivers and amplifiers, where that isn't the case. And you want to pay attention to how the original part, was configured on the board. And there again, not that I'm trying to create, component paranoia, but that may even be incorrect. And the reason I say that is because, for example, let's say that you're removing a part because it failed. And the reason why it failed is, well, it's under investigation. You're trying to figure that out, which is a good idea. If you're dealing with a failed component, sometimes it's not good just to say, okay, well, I'm going to replace it. Well, great. Only to find out that, boom, the next one fails because you didn't get to the root of the problem. Well, that being the case, you're going to want to pay attention to whether or not the replacement, the part that was on the board originally, which may have been a replacement to begin with. Maybe somebody was in there before you and they installed a component, they did so incorrectly, and then it failed, so they gave up on it, left it there, and then here you are repeating the process. So I try to help people to think their way through a process, not just say, okay, here's how you do it, pop it in, wham bam, thank you Sam, and there it is. Well, the thing is, use all the pieces of information you have at your disposal, and it doesn't take long. The reason why this is taking long is because I'm explaining it. But again, if you just look and say, okay, well, the board indicates that positive is over here, the original component here is mounted with the positive side here, that seems to be okay, but let me just be sure that that is correct, being that the part did fail after all. So you look at the schematic and you find out, oh, wait a minute. According to the schematic, this part is in circuit with the polarity opposite to what it is on the board here. But the screen printing indicates it's correct. And so at that point, you're kind of doing some detective work and a little bit of forensic work, and you come to find out that in fact the schematic is correct. Or is it? The point is, though, not to take any one piece of information as gospel. You have to sort of be thinking your way through as you're going through the process so that you can catch something that's not correct when it comes to printing, or catch something that's not correct on the schematic, or catch something that's not correct as far as the way the person before you installed it. And that's what I'm trying to point out. And same thing with like transistors and all that. You'll see the silk screening on the board indicating emitter base collector or emitter collector base, whatever. And you really have to pay attention to that stuff. And when you're replacing transistors, same thing. Note the original component and the way it's mounted in there, just in case the silk screening is incorrect, but the person who installed it did install it correct. So if you pull it out and just install it according to the way that the silk screening has you install it, you might find out that you've just shorted a transistor when you powered the unit up for testing, and you're looking at the board saying, well, you know, the transistor's mounted correctly according to the silk screening on the board, but come to find out that that's incorrect, and the original component that you pulled out was installed correctly, but you didn't pay attention to that. So just think your way through things is the point. Now again, I understand that that was a long-winded explanation, as I do a lot of times when I'm going into detail, but you have to understand this kind of stuff, because if you don't, you know, you might run across the problems that I'm referring to. So, you know, as my late father always said, measure twice, cut once. So pay attention to the details so that you don't get yourself into a wreck. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, and I've mentioned it before in other videos, is that before I put any component into a piece of equipment, I always test it for, at the very least, a pass-fail test. But for example, like with this little capacitance and ESR meter here, I will check caps before I install them to make sure that I'm not installing a dud. And I did that before the video actually, but because I forgot to mention it, I'll just give you an example. I'm hooked onto one of those caps there. And those caps, by the way, are 2200 mics at 40 volts, okay? And you can see that, you know, ESR is great, and the capacitance and all that. So I just want to, you know, get that ballpark. I just want to know that there's no serious problems with any of the caps that I'm putting in, just in case a dud you know, got through the quality control process and, you know, made it to my bench. But anyways, that being the case, also too, what am I putting in? These are really good EPCOS TDK caps. They are 125 degree caps, low ESR, 10,000 hour caps, so they're really long life caps. So again, as I always say, I make it a point to put in the best that I can get my hands on, considering the times we're in with, you know, and I've mentioned it before, the supply chain issues and shortages and a lot of stuff on back order. What I'm going to do now is just flip the board over, solder these in, and we'll go from there. So here we are around back, and I'm getting ready to solder in the main filter caps. So how do I go about getting a bomb-proof solder joint? And you know, there's different different ways to skin a cat, as I've said before. Different people have different methods, in other words, that work for them, but it's essentially all the same in order to get a good, solid, bomb-proof solder joint. And the first thing I'm going to do is clip these leads down. And in this case, I don't really have to worry too much about the component, the caps falling out, despite the fact that they're hanging upside down on the bottom of the board here, because the lead diameter is pretty thick, so they're pretty tight in the in the through hole there. So for the most part, if you're dealing with leads, you know, in most cases you are, that are narrower in diameter, and you know the component is hanging there all loose, you're going to have to fold them over. So anyways, that being the case, let me go ahead and clip these down nice and short, okay? And some people will solder in the component with the leads left long, and that's fine. In this case, I can clip them down. I'm not worried about it. Okay, so next, I'm going to apply something called flux. Just a little drop there of some flux in an effort to promote something called wetting action. Okay, wetting as in W-E-T-T-I-N-G. wetting action. And what is wetting action, you ask? It's essentially when the solder combines molecularly at the surface level, and that can only occur when the area is free of contaminants and oxides, and that's essentially what the flux promotes. When the flux becomes superheated and starts to melt, it removes those surface oxides and in turn promotes that wetting action. And again, in brief, that wetting action is just something that allows that molecular bonding, I guess, at the surface level of the solder and the metals, and it kind of forms a new alloy, I guess, if you will. Okay, when they all kind of combine together, and that's what establishes a really bomb-proof solder joint. Okay, and also too, you always want to start off with a little bit of solder on the tip, and you always want to keep a little bit of solder on the tip. And I have my temperature set at 698 degrees Fahrenheit, or what is that, about 370 C, somewhere around there. But anyways, that's kind of the zone there. But anyways, what you want to do is when you go into the, and this isn't really a soldering lesson per se, you'll need to kind of dive deeper to get more detail on that. But when you dive into a solder joint, you want to pay particular attention to dwell time. You don't want to camp out on the solder joint too long and overheat the pad, cause it to lift, etc. But you can't be squeamish or kind of scared when you're going in. You just need to go in and, with your tip, just go in, and the solder will start, or excuse me, the flux will start, bubbling away. It'll get superheated. Introduce your, let me pull a little more solder out of the dispenser there. And you just need to go in with your solder just aggressively and just make it happen. Just go in and be very, very decisive about it. And let me just demonstrate right here. And flood the pad, okay? And there you go. You have a nice, that's a nice clean solder joint there, okay? So again, just go into it, and you saw that smoke that was really coming off of the, solder joint there. Once the tip of the soldering iron hit that flux, and really superheated that flux and started melting it. It was burning away oxides, and I was introducing the solder, and we had that wetting action occurring, and we had the nice formation of a bomb-proof solder joint. So once again, let's go right into it, okay? Flood that pad. Okay, there we go. And again, I don't want to camp out on it too long. A couple of seconds is fine. It's gonna vary a little bit. Sometimes, you have to sit on a solder joint just a little bit longer because, the amount of heat that's being pulled away depending on the size of the solder joint, and which is going to dictate your dwell time, how long you're going to sit on that solder joint. But again, your dwell time should be pretty short. You don't want to camp out too long, a couple seconds or so, not much more. You want to get off that solder joint pretty fast. And there you go. So let me jump on over here. Okay. There we go. And I'm going to clean up all of that flux afterwards, and I'll kind of go into that a little bit just to leave a nice clean joint there. Okay. There we go. And then I'll go into, cleaning up the solder joints there. So now I just want to get all this cleaned up, and what I use is 99% or 99.9% anhydrous alcohol. Anhydrous meaning it's has a very, very super low water content. This is almost pure alcohol, in other words, and it dries very, very quickly, and it's got a nice bite to it to get everything cleaned up. And I'll just apply some alcohol here on a swab and just clean the area real nice. But these babies came out really nice and bomb proof, nice and solid. Don't know if you can see that, depending on how I'm angling the board. But some very nice bomb proof solder joints and nice and pretty, if I do say so myself. So there we go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the rest of the recapping, but I'm not going to do it on camera. I already showed you a couple of solder joints and how to achieve some nice bomb proof solder joints. So I will come back when all the caps are on board, and I'll get the board back into the synth and actually start the power up and testing process. So I will be back in a moment. So here I am with the boards unplugged once again on this Siel Cruise. And the reason I had to do that during preliminary function testing, after getting the recapped power supply back in the unit, there were some functions that were not operating as they should. So upon further examination of the boards, I found some more connection issues. So for starters, on this section of a poly board here, the polyphonic board, the clavichord control wasn't working. So initially I wanted to make sure that the switch contacts were engaging, and in this case it's one of those spring contacts that engages a contact in the switch. So kind of an interesting layout as far as the switches are concerned. So I'm going to zoom in and show you that issue first and why that was a problem. And there were several other problems that I encountered, and it all came down to bad connection. So this specimen here has a lot of connection issues, and some pieces of equipment and their soldering, their traces, the type of PCBs and traces and all that, sometimes they're just more problematic. And that's just the way the mop flops, as they say. So let me just go ahead and zoom in real quick on something. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to be sure of is that the switch contacts were bridging. They were engaging with one another when the switch was in its on position, which is where it is right now. So off, of course, we're going to get 0, zilch, nada, and on. Okay, so I at least knew that the switch contacts were bridging, they were engaging. So the next thing I wanted to do is, and let me see here, let me zoom back out again. Okay, so here's that one of those switch contacts that I was pointing out when I was zoomed in. And all I really wanted to do was trace out the traces, and you may not be able to see too much detail because I'm zoomed out, and depending on what you're watching this video on, if you're using a little phone or a little tablet, whatever, but that's not important. You don't really need to see a lot of detail, but just a bird's eye view. I was just going through from the this contact here and tracing out the trace to make sure that it wasn't broken anywhere, and as you can see, yes, there was a break. And the reason I didn't spot it initially is because I don't have the greatest eyes in the world anymore. And there was still some dark green etching on the board, and when I looked closer I noticed that the actual trace was kind of rubbed off, or at least it looked like it was rubbed off. Whatever, these traces are really thin on this board, and you'll find that on a lot of these boards in vintage gear. and a lot of gear for that matter. So there you have it. But anyways, you can see now that, okay, I have the switch off right now. Let me see if I can. Okay, so I think it's over here. So let me flick the switch on. Okay, and there you have it. So I have my signal reestablished all the way through after I took care of this bad trace. And all I did was, and I'll zoom in real quick, and all I did was just glued down, you know, with an epoxy. I glued down the trace, and then I just soldered the junctions and just bridged everything together. So I didn't want to get into a fancy trace repair because, again, it wasn't necessary. I wasn't going for super pretty, but at the same time, I mean, it's not a horrible looking repair, of course. And I coated over it and all that stuff, and you could see where I kind of masked off the board a little bit and applied some coating, and you know, again, you know, I used copper trace in there, and so it is a very, very solid bomb-proof repair. It's not going anywhere, but I wasn't going for super pretty. I wasn't trying to match it up with all the other traces, obviously, as you can see. And one thing I am going to do when I mount the board back in place, you notice that this section of trace that was damaged was where the mounting hole is located. However, on the let me zoom in. It's the other side of the board, not this side, but the other side of the board where these plastic washers are placed, and so the board is actually screwed in from the other side. So there wasn't a screw or anything sitting on the trace, but I'm still going to, before I mount the board back in, I'm going to put a little piece of a neoprene. I got some really thin neoprene foam that I'm going to place over the board in this area, just in case, you know, it was sitting on something over time. I don't know how that would have damaged the trace unless the board was kind of moving around when people were working the switches. Maybe when these switches were being worked and all that, maybe the board was just moving a little bit over time and just kind of rubbing the trace away, because that's almost how it looked. Like I said, it looked like it was kind of rubbed away, and there was still that green etching that I described, but the trace itself was it looked like it was kind of worn through. You know, it wasn't burnt, it wasn't anything like that. It doesn't even look like it was cut. It just looked more worn away. So maybe the board wasn't secured good enough, and over time working the switches, the board was just, like I said, moving around ever so slightly, just enough to rub the trace away. So there you have it. Okay, so the next problems that I was having, again, more connection issues, and I've been through this board, and I mentioned that in the previous video when I had the board back in the unit. I went through and touched up a lot of solder joints on both sides, and you know, this side as well. I redid all of these solder joints, every single one of them. I went through and redid them. Over here too, I just really went through this board and took the time to reflow all of these solder joints that you see in here. Okay, so let me turn it back around. So one problem that I was having was with the release VR, and there was a section of trace here that I had to repair, and it was a hard one to find. Of course, I found it with a continuity meter, but there was just a little micro fracture, and I really had to zoom in with some magnification to see exactly where it was. And but there was a little tiny micro fracture, just enough to interrupt the function of this release VR here. And then over here, the vibrato, both, you know, the vibrato depth and the speed and all that were non-functioning when I was function testing it. And there was another section of trace in here, right near the solder joint, that was interrupted, that I repaired. And initially, of course, I checked the mono board, because there's that vibrato switch on the mono board. So I did the same thing that I did on the poly board that I just showed you. I went through and checked the switch contacts of that vibrato switch and make sure that they were engaging. They were. I traced out the the traces on that board. Everything was intact all the way through that board. So that board was 100% intact. So I knew it had to be over here. So sure enough, like I just mentioned, when I started assessing these traces and solder joints and going through with my meter and checking the VRs and checking the solder joints and traces, I found those dead spots like I told you, and had to do some trace repair. So moral of the story: the DMM, the multimeter, whatever, is your best friend. So there you go. So I'm going to move on and talk about another problem. Okay, and here we are at the bottom of the keyboard, or the key bed. If you recall in the previous videos concerning this synth, I mentioned this is our mono board here, and right behind it is the polyphonic board. And these are the spring contacts that engage the bus bars. And what happened was, during function testing, the original, let me grab it here if I can get my fingers around it. The original spring contact for the D key right behind here, the D note, it finally broke off the board, and it was in rough shape to begin with, because that was the key that was worked on prior to me. That was that key that had the broken key guide, that key guide that I had to refabricate and all that. I pointed that out in the previous video as well. Well, that key obviously had work done on it, and it was, the contact was probably being bent and this and that when the guy was working on it, but it finally had enough and it just broke away. So I was trying to figure, well, what can I use in place of that, because they measure about 1.6 millimeters in in diameter. So I was looking around, and I found that the parts supplier, and some of you may be familiar with them, Synth, especially you synth people, you'll know who they are. But and I think that's how their name is pronounced, Synth or something like that. But anyways, they used to have those spring contacts, but they are currently, at least at the time of this video, they're currently out of stock. And essentially, okay, it's a spring, nothing real fancy schmancy, but it's a very narrow spring, like I said, about 1.6 diameter in diameter, and then the length, you could see about how long these are here from top to where they solder onto the board. I didn't measure it out, but maybe almost a couple inches. So I found a place online that had some springs that are used in model building, and I didn't purchase one, but they were about the right size as far as diameter, but it didn't indicate what the length of the springs were, and I couldn't tell by the photograph. So but anyway, so I was thinking, and I ended up sending them a message, actually asking them, well, how long are these springs? And anyways, I haven't heard back yet, but not a big deal. So I was thinking, well, what can I use? And then it came to me, you know what? Try a guitar string. Guitar strings are fairly springy. The only thing is, though, the guitar string is a bit stiffer than these original spring contacts. I think they'll still work just fine. So this is an E string, and it's flexible, but it's still stiffer than the original, as I just mentioned. So I'm going to try it out. I'm sure it's going to work out just fine by the time I get it soldered to the board, cut to length, soldered to the board, and all that. Hopefully it'll work out. It's not going to be too stiff. I think there'll be enough bend to it to conform to the, you know, when the key is pressed and the contact, you know, engages the bus bar. There has to be a little bit of, you know, let's say my finger is the bus bar. Well, there has to be a little give to it. There has to be some flexibility to it. And I think the guitar string, even when I cut it down a little bit, will still have enough flex to it to work out okay. I'll report back on that when I do the final function testing. But that's another thing I wanted to point out. If it works out fine, which I'm sure it will, then if you run into this problem and you can't find springs in that size, or you're having a hard time finding them, not that, you know, springs involve rocket science, but you might find that a guitar string, you know, an E string will work out just fine. It's about the same diameter as well and has enough flex to it where I think it's going to do just fine, like I said. So anyways, let me go ahead and move on. Okay, so here she is, all completed. I have a few little things I have to do cosmetically and get this thing detailed, but otherwise everything is done. There was a lot of connection issues to deal with, even things that I didn't show in this video because, you know, in the interest of time, otherwise these videos start getting really long, and this one's already getting long. And anyways, I pointed out the main problems though. So the mono function is restored. So there's that. And then let me just show that the polyphonic end of things is working fine. Okay, and now for the polyphonic part of the synth. And you remember too that I mentioned the clavichord wasn't working because of that broken trace. Well, anyways, let me just demonstrate that the polyphonic part of the synth is working. Okay, and now the clavichord. Okay, so there it is. I'm not going to do a big old demo or anything because this video has gotten really long, but everything that I set out to fix has been fixed. Lots of connection issues. Like I said, some that I didn't show on camera in the interest of time, but you know, everything is doing good now. I just want to cosmetically detail this thing, you know, get all the knobs back on and all that, and then this thing is ready to go. So as I always say, guys, peace, love, music, and the vintage audio that brings it to your ears. Till next time, take care.
This is a poor man's shoe production.